Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker, a time of divine wrath festering bodies and the slow collapse of everything you thought was permanent. We're diving into what life was really like during the Black Death. Forget the romantic medieval tales of knights and castles, the sanitized history books that gloss over humanity's darkest chapter. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are you listening from a place where modern medicine can cure what once killed millions? Are you safe in a world where antibiotics exist, where hospitals have ventilators, where we understand that disease spreads through microorganisms rather than divine punishment? Now dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just been born in the year 1331, the good news. You're entering one of the most prosperous periods in medieval history. The bad news, you have exactly 16 years before the world ends. Welcome to the last generation of the medieval world. Your first breath fills with the acrid smoke of your father's forge, but it's not unpleasant. It's the smell of prosperity, of iron being transformed into tools that build civilization. You are born in Siena, one of the jewels of medieval Italy, where the streets hum with commerce, and the cathedral's black and white stripes reach toward a God who still seems to be listening to human prayers. Your mother, Maria, wraps you in wool that traveled from the sheep farms of England, across the English Channel, through the markets of Bruges, over the Alpine passes, and into the hands of Italian merchants who understand that comfort can be bought and sold like any other commodity. The coins that paid for this luxury were minted from silver dug from German mines by men whose names you'll never know, but whose labor keeps the wheels of international commerce turning. This is globalization, medieval style, and you are lucky enough to be born into its golden age. The Black Sea trade routes bring spices from Asia. The Mediterranean carries goods between Christian and Muslim ports. The overland routes connect the farthest reaches of the known world in a web of commercial relationships that seem as permanent as the mountains themselves. Your father, Giovanni, is a smith, not wealthy enough to be a merchant prince, not poor enough to beg, but skilled enough to keep food on the table and respect in his voice when he speaks to customers. His hands, scarred from years of hot metal and flying sparks, tell the story of a life spent transforming raw materials into useful objects. Every scar represents a lesson learned, a skill mastered, a moment when pain became wisdom. These hands will be the first to teach you that strength comes from endurance, that beauty emerges from fire, and that every tool has a purpose that extends beyond its immediate function. A horseshoe doesn't just protect a horse's hoof. It enables transportation that connects distant markets. A kitchen knife doesn't just cut food. It feeds families that create communities. A sword doesn't just kill enemies. It protects the peaceful order that allows smiths to work without fear. You don't know it yet, but these lessons will be the only things that survive what's coming. The philosophical framework your father builds into your understanding of craftsmanship will prove more durable than the political structures, religious certainties, and social hierarchies that currently define your world. The house you grow up in sits on the Via del Ferro, Iron Street, where the metalworkers cluster together for mutual support and shared resources. Your building is 3 stories tall, with the forge on the ground floor, your family's living space on the second floor, and storage in the attic. The second floors of neighboring buildings lean so close together that on summer nights when everyone opens their windows for relief from the heat, you can hear entire conversations from the family across the narrow street. Below your window, the cobblestones echo with the wooden wheels of carts bringing goods from Florence, Venice, Constantinople, and ports whose names sound like music when the merchants pronounce them. Your childhood soundtrack is the symphony of international commerce, the clatter of hooves on stone, the shouts of traders negotiating in languages that blend Italian with Greek, Arabic, and Germanic dialects, the ring of coins being counted by fingers that know the difference between Florentine florins, Venetian ducats, and Byzantine byzants. The sounds tell stories more vivid than any book. The heavy carts that rumble past before dawn carry goods destined for the great fairs of Champagne, where European merchants meet their counterparts from the East to exchange products that have traveled thousands of miles to reach consumers who take international trade for granted. The lighter vehicles that clatter past at midday bring local produce from the countryside, wine from vineyards that have been cultivated since Roman times, grain from fields that feed a population larger and more prosperous than Europe will see again for centuries. By the time you're 7, you're already spending your mornings in the forge, not because child labor is expected, but because learning begins with observation, and children are naturally curious about the magical transformation of metal. You watch your father heat iron until it glows like captive sunlight, then strike it with precise blows that shape it according to his will. The heat is brutal, especially in summer when the forge fire combines with Mediterranean sunshine to create temperatures that test human endurance. But you learn to read the fire's moods, to understand that different colors of flame produce different effects in the metal. Blue flame burns hottest but hardest to control. Yellow flame provides steady heat for long projects. Red flame offers gentle warming for delicate work. You learn to read the metal's moods by its color changes. White hot means the iron is malleable, ready to accept new shapes without resistance. Orange hot means it's hardening, becoming stubborn, requiring more force to bend. Cherry red means it's cooling but still workable. Black means waiting, planning, preparing for the next round of heating and shaping. You don't realize you're learning philosophy disguised as metallurgy. The patience required to wait for metal to reach proper temperature. The judgment needed to strike with appropriate force at exactly the right moment. The acceptance that some projects require multiple heating cycles, that complex shapes emerge through repeated effort rather than single dramatic gestures. Your afternoons belong to the streets, where education continues through play and observation. Siena in the 1330s is a city drunk on its own success, staggering from one commercial triumph to another, like a prosperous merchant celebrating a particularly profitable venture. The banking houses of the Bonsignori and Gallerani families have made Siena richer than some kingdoms, their letters of credit accepted from London to Constantinople. Construction continues on the cathedral, each marble column and intricate carving a declaration that this prosperity will endure for centuries. The stonemasons work with the confidence of men building for eternity, taking time to perfect details that only God and future generations will see clearly. The massive nave, when completed, will hold the entire population of Siena, with room for visitors from neighboring cities. You play with the children of weavers, bakers, stoneworkers, and even a few merchants' sons who attend the cathedral school and speak Latin like they were born in ancient Rome. These friendships cross social boundaries that in other times and places would be strictly enforced, but prosperity makes Siena's citizens generous with their children's associations. The games you play reflect the world around you, with the unconscious accuracy of children who absorb their environment like sponges. Mock tournaments with wooden swords teach boys the basic skills of warfare, while girls organize elaborate pageants that mirror the religious festivals that mark Siena's calendar. Trading games with acorns as florins and stones as precious cargo introduce economic concepts that will prove useful if you live long enough to apply them. Sometimes you play Crusader, chasing imaginary Saracens through the winding alleys, while shouting battle cries learned from veterans who actually fought in the Holy Land. Sometimes you play Merchant, negotiating elaborate deals for nothing more valuable than marbles, while learning the art of persuasion that drives international commerce. Sometimes you play Priest, conducting mock services that combine genuine religious devotion with childish fascination for ritual and ceremony. You are rehearsing for futures that will never come, learning skills for a world that will not survive your childhood. But the habits of mind you develop, the ways of thinking and solving problems, will prove adaptable to circumstances no one can imagine in these golden years before the storm. Your evenings are spent in the warm glow of oil lamps, listening to stories that connect your family to the broader sweep of human history. Your grandmother, Nonna Isabella, tells tales that span decades and reveal how much the world has changed within living memory. She remembers the Great Famine of 1315, when the rains wouldn't stop and people ate bark, leather, and things that shouldn't be mentioned in front of children. Those were years when prosperity seemed as distant as the Holy Land, when survival required daily miracles, and communities pulled together or died together, but those stories feel ancient, mythical, like tales of dragons or saints' miraculous interventions. Surely such catastrophes couldn't happen now, not with the warehouses full of grain from Sicily and southern France, not with the trade routes bringing security, along with abundance from every corner of the known world. Nonna Isabella also tells stories of her own grandmother, who remembered when Siena was just another hill town, struggling for survival among more powerful neighbors. The transformation from provincial backwater to international banking center happened within 2 generations, proof that human ingenuity and favorable circumstances can create prosperity that seems divinely ordained. These stories teach you that change is possible, that circumstances improve through human effort, combined with fortunate timing. You absorb the lesson that prosperity isn't natural or permanent, but you misunderstand its implications. You learn that things can get better, but no one teaches you that they can also get much, much worse. On feast days, the entire city becomes a stage where prosperity performs for itself, and any visiting merchants who might carry tales of Siena's success to distant markets. During the Palio, Siena's famous horse race, you watch the neighborhoods compete with a passion that borders on warfare, but remains safely contained within ritualized boundaries. The contrada of the tower versus the contrada of the shell, the contrada of the eagle against the contrada of the panther. Each district's identity is bound up in the speed of a horse and the skill of a rider, but the real competition is between different visions of civic pride and community loyalty. The winners celebrate like they've conquered kingdoms. The losers mourn like they've lost their souls. This intensity, this investment in local identity, will prove to be both salvation and curse in the years ahead. Communities that hang together during good times often fragment under pressure, but occasionally the bonds forged in prosperity prove strong enough to endure catastrophe. The pageantry surrounding the Palio reveals prosperity's cultural effects. Silk banners that cost more than most families earn in a year. Horses bred for speed and beauty rather than practical work. Elaborate ceremonies that serve no purpose except demonstrating that Siena can afford to spend enormous resources on entertainment. You watch these displays with the wide-eyed wonder of childhood, not understanding that you're witnessing the end of an age. Medieval prosperity reaches its peak in the decades before the plague, creating artistic and cultural achievements that subsequent generations will struggle to match. The resources devoted to beauty, ceremony, and civic pride represent a confidence in the future that will soon seem tragically naive. Sunday mornings mean the cathedral, where you kneel on stone floors worn smooth by generations of worshippers, while light filters through stained glass windows that transform sunlight into stories. The colored glass depicts saints and biblical scenes, but it also celebrates contemporary donors whose wealth funded these permanent reminders of their generosity. The priest speaks of God's plan, of the divine order that places kings above merchants, merchants above craftsmen, craftsmen above peasants, and everyone above the beggars who remind the prosperous that fortune can change without warning. It's a comforting hierarchy, predictable as the sunrise, offering everyone a clear understanding of their place in a cosmic order that has endured for centuries. You have your place in this hierarchy, and that place feels secure. Your father's skill ensures respect and steady income. Your family's position in the community is established and recognized. Your future appears to follow predictable patterns that have governed similar lives for generations. The prayers you recite ask for protection from dangers that seem distant and manageable. War, which rarely touches Siena directly. Famine, which modern trade networks should prevent. Disease, which claims individuals but surely couldn't threaten entire populations. The litany of potential catastrophes feels like insurance against unlikely events rather than preparation for probable disasters. By the time you turn 10, your father begins teaching you the real work, the skills that will define your adult identity and provide your livelihood. Your hands, still soft from childhood, learn to grip the hammer properly, to strike with rhythm rather than pure force, to read the subtle signs that indicate when metal is ready for shaping. The first sword you help forge is crooked, the blade wavy where it should be straight, the balance wrong for effective use. Your father doesn't scold you or express disappointment. Instead, he melts it down and lets you try again, explaining that failure is just metal waiting for another chance to become something useful. This approach to failure as opportunity rather than catastrophe becomes central to your developing worldview. Mistakes provide information about what doesn't work, making success more likely on subsequent attempts. Problems are temporary obstacles that persistence and skill can overcome. Setbacks create learning opportunities that make future achievements more satisfying. The lessons learned at the forge extend far beyond metallurgy. Patience, because metal can't be rushed without becoming brittle. Precision, because small errors in measurement create large problems in finished products. Persistence, because complex projects require sustained effort over long periods. Collaboration, because some tasks require multiple people working in careful coordination. The apprentices who work alongside your father become your older brothers in everything but blood, teaching you skills that no formal education could provide. They show you how to judge a customer's wealth by the quality of his boots, how to negotiate prices without appearing greedy, how to maintain tools so they last for decades rather than months. More importantly, they teach you songs that would make priests weep, stories that reveal the gap between official morality and actual human behavior, and practical wisdom about navigating the complex social relationships that govern medieval life. The forge becomes more than a workplace. It's a sanctuary where men become brothers through shared sweat and mutual respect. They explain why German steel is superior to local iron, how trade networks bring materials from distant sources, why certain techniques work better in winter than summer. This education in practical knowledge complements your formal religious instruction, creating a worldview that balances faith with evidence, tradition with innovation. You're 12 when you first notice the beggars, not because they weren't there before, but because you're now old enough to understand what their presence means. They've always been huddled in the shadows of prosperity, surviving on scraps and charity, but now you can see the system that creates both wealth and poverty within the same community. For every family like yours, comfortable in the middle reaches of society, there are dozens who survive on the margins of subsistence. Your father gives them work when he can, sweeping the forge, hauling coal, organizing tools, not from pure charity, but from understanding that prosperity shared creates more prosperity for everyone. He teaches you that the beggars serve a function beyond their obvious economic role. They remind the prosperous that fortune can change, that current success doesn't guarantee future security. They provide opportunities for charity that demonstrate wealth while serving religious obligations. Most importantly, they represent the alternative that motivates everyone else to work harder and save more carefully. The years 1340 to 1345 feel like the world's adolescence, growing stronger and more confident each season, while displaying the cocky optimism of youth who haven't yet encountered serious obstacles. New trade routes open to the east, bringing luxury goods and exotic ideas. The banking houses expand their operations to London, Paris, Bruges, and even the distant reaches of Flanders and Germanic territories. Your city grows rich enough to commission frescoes that rival anything in Florence or Rome. The artistic renaissance that will later define the Italian character begins in prosperous cities like Siena, where merchants have enough surplus wealth to patronize painters, sculptors, and architects, whose work celebrates both divine glory and human achievement. The future feels not just bright, but inevitable. Like sunrise after a pleasant night's sleep, every year brings new opportunities, expanded horizons, increased prosperity. The trajectory seems clear. More trade, more wealth, more cultural achievement, more influence in the complex web of relationships that connects European cities to Asian markets. You absorb this optimism through daily experience. Customers arrive at the forge with increasingly elaborate commissions, decorative metalwork for wealthy households, specialized tools for expanding craft industries, weapons that serve more ceremonial than practical purposes, demonstrating that Siena can afford military display without immediate military necessity. You're 14 when you begin to sense the first hairline cracks in paradise, subtle changes that adults notice but don't discuss openly in front of children. The weather turns strange. Summers too dry for optimal harvests, winters too harsh for comfortable heating, spring rains that arrive too late or not at all. The harvests, while still adequate, require more work for smaller yields. Farmers complain about soil exhaustion, about crops that seem less resistant to disease, about livestock that don't thrive the way they did in previous generations. But these seem like temporary setbacks, natural fluctuations that occur within longer cycles of abundance. The merchants speak in hushed tones about problems in their distant operations, about clients who pay late or not at all, about political instability in regions that once provided reliable profits. But international trade has always involved risks, and successful merchants plan for occasional losses that are more than offset by overall gains. More troubling are the reports filtering back from the eastern trade routes. Caravans that arrive weeks behind schedule with tales of disrupted communications, ships that return with partial cargoes, and stories of ports that were inexplicably closed to foreign merchants. Political changes in distant lands that affect commercial relationships in ways no one fully understands. But these concerns seem manageable, temporary obstacles that experienced traders can navigate through patience and flexibility. The overall trajectory of prosperity continues upward, creating enough momentum to carry the community through whatever minor setbacks might arise. Your 15th year brings responsibility that makes you feel ancient, while simultaneously revealing how much you still need to learn. You're no longer just helping in the forge, you're contributing skills that customers recognize and request specifically. The sword hilts you stay wrapped under combat conditions. The horseshoes you shape fit properly and last for hundreds of miles. The decorative ironwork you create pleases clients who could afford to buy from anyone. Customers begin asking for your work by name, recognizing a family skill that spans generations while acknowledging your personal contribution to its continuation. This recognition brings pride, tempered by awareness that reputation must be earned daily through consistent quality, rather than inherited automatically through family connections. You begin to imagine your own family, your own apprentices, your own version of the prosperity that seems to be your birthright. Marriage to someone whose family complements yours economically and socially. Children who will learn metalworking skills that you'll teach with the same patience your father showed you. A future that extends the present in predictable directions. These dreams feel realistic because they're based on patterns that have governed similar lives for generations. Sons typically follow fathers' trades, modified by individual talent and economic opportunities. Families arrange marriages that serve both romantic and practical purposes. Communities maintain continuity through traditions that adapt slowly to changing circumstances. The possibility that these patterns might be completely disrupted doesn't occur to anyone, because such disruption has no precedent in living memory. Wars affect political boundaries, but rarely eliminate entire populations. Famines create temporary hardship, but don't fundamentally alter social structures. Diseases claim individual victims, but don't threaten the existence of civilization itself. The rumors begin in the spring of 1347, carried by merchants returning from their eastern ventures like seeds, blown by winds whose origin no one can identify. There's talk of a strange sickness in the Crimean trading posts, of entire caravans found dead on roads that previously bustled with commercial activity. The descriptions vary depending on who tells the story and how many times it's been retold, but certain details remain consistent. The disease strikes quickly, killing victims within days rather than weeks. It spreads through contact, making it dangerous to approach the sick or handle their possessions. It produces distinctive symptoms that make diagnosis unmistakable, but disease is always stalking the edges of civilization, claiming those foolish enough to venture too far from the safety of established communities. Travel has always involved health risks that most people avoid by staying close to home. Surely this is nothing more than another regional epidemic that will burn itself out before affecting the civilized centers of European commerce. The trading posts around the Black Sea have always been dangerous places where European merchants interact with peoples whose customs and diseases are unfamiliar. It's reasonable to expect that such contact occasionally produces illnesses that affect travelers who choose to accept those risks in pursuit of exceptional profits. By autumn, the rumors have grown teeth sharp enough to draw blood from complacency. Ships arriving from Constantinople carry stories of cities emptied overnight, of bodies stacked like cordwood in streets that once bustled with international commerce. But Constantinople is far away, separated from Siena by mountains, political boundaries, and weeks of dangerous travel. Distance, everyone assumes, provides protection. Diseases that spread through contact can't cross vast geographic barriers without human carriers, and humans can be quarantined or turned away if they show signs of illness. The natural barriers that separate Italy from the Eastern Mediterranean should serve as filters that prevent whatever's happening over there from affecting life over here. But the stories become more specific and therefore more disturbing. Not just reports of disease, but descriptions of social collapse. Government officials fleeing their responsibilities, religious authorities abandoning their flocks, merchants deserting trade relationships that took generations to establish, the kind of complete breakdown that indicates something more catastrophic than ordinary epidemic. Your 16th birthday arrives with October's chill, bringing responsibilities that feel like privileges and gifts that seem like promises of future prosperity. Your father gives you your own hammer, its handle worn smooth by his hands and now ready for yours. The tool feels like a crown, a scepter, a key to a kingdom that will be yours to inherit and improve. The hammer represents more than just a tool. It embodies the continuation of family tradition through individual effort. Your father's skill, combined with your developing abilities, creates the possibility that the next generation will achieve even greater success than the current one. Progress through persistence, improvement through dedication, prosperity through competence. That night you fall asleep to the familiar sounds that have provided your life's soundtrack. The night watch calling the hours in voices that echo off stone buildings, the distant laughter from taverns where merchants celebrate successful transactions, the creak of carts making early deliveries to markets that never seem to rest. It's the last night the world will sound normal, the final evening when the medieval universe feels stable and predictable. Tomorrow will bring news that transforms everything you understand about safety, prosperity, and the reliability of human institutions. Because tomorrow the ships arrive from Genoa carrying more than cargo. They bring the future that will destroy the present, the disease that will end the world and begin another. Tonight, you sleep peacefully in a universe where tomorrow resembles today, where patterns continue, where life makes sense. But that universe is about to die, and you will be among the witnesses to its death and the midwives to whatever is born from its corpse. You wake to screaming that doesn't belong in any world you understand. Not the usual morning chaos of a busy city starting its daily routine, not the controlled noise of commerce and conversation, but something primal, desperate, animalistic. The sound that humans make when they discover that the universe operates by different rules than they believed, when safety becomes illusion and tomorrow becomes uncertain. Through your window you see people running through the streets with the distinctive gait of panic, not towards something they want, but away from everything they fear. Their faces show expressions you've never seen before, the look of people who have just learned that their fundamental assumptions about reality were wrong, that the world is far more dangerous than they imagined. Your father is already awake, standing in the doorway with the expression of a man watching his house catch fire, while calculating whether any possessions are worth retrieving before the flames reach his family. His craftsman's hands, accustomed to solving problems through skill and patience, hang useless at his sides because the approaching problem can't be solved with tools or technique. The news travels faster than the disease itself, racing through the city's commercial networks with the speed that only terror can achieve. 3 ships limped into the port of Genoa yesterday, their crews more dead than alive, their cargo contaminated with something that transforms prosperous ports into charnel houses within days. The survivors, delirious with fever and covered in the distinctive black swellings that give the plague its name, spoke in broken phrases about ports that died overnight, about trade routes that became graveyards, about a disease that spreads through the air itself and kills with certainty that rivals divine judgment. The port authorities, wise in the ways of commerce but ignorant in the ways of pandemic, made the decision that will be remembered as the moment medieval Europe began to die. They allowed the ships to unload their cargo before anyone understood what they'd brought ashore, along with the silks, spices, and precious metals that had made the journey profitable. You dress quickly and follow your father to the forge, where the other craftsmen are already gathering in the way that communities instinctively cluster together when faced with threats they don't understand. The blacksmith's quarter has always been the neighborhood's informal council chamber, the place where information gets hammered into truth on the anvil of collective wisdom. But this morning, wisdom has nothing to offer because no one has experience with catastrophe on this scale. The usual sources of guidance, political authorities, religious leaders, wealthy merchants, are as confused and frightened as everyone else. The expertise that normally provides direction in crisis situations simply doesn't exist for problems this unprecedented. Marco the baker speaks first, his voice tight with controlled panic that threatens to break into hysteria at any moment. His cousin trades with merchants from Genoa, and the reports filtering back through commercial networks are beyond belief. Entire families dead within days, bodies left in the streets because there aren't enough living to bury the dead. The disease spreads through touch, through breath, through proximity to the dying. The descriptions challenge everything you understand about how disease operates. Previous epidemics affected the weak, the old, the malnourished. This plague kills indiscriminately, claiming healthy adults as readily as sickly children. It spreads with a speed that makes quarantine impossible and strikes with a lethality that makes medical intervention useless. Your father's response is practical, measured, drawing on the craftsman's instinct to solve problems through careful analysis and appropriate action. Trade routes can be closed. The city gates can be sealed. Siena has walls, and walls exist to keep unwanted things outside, whether those things are armies, wild animals, or invisible enemies that travel with merchants. The other men nod, grasping for the comfort of familiar solutions to unfamiliar problems. But you notice something that chills you more than their words, the silence from the forge. For the first time in your memory, the fire remains unlit, because no customers have arrived seeking horseshoes, tools, or repairs. The rhythm of normal life has already begun to falter before the disease has even reached your city. This absence of customers reveals something profound about how quickly social structures can collapse when people lose confidence in the future. Commerce depends on assumptions about tomorrow. That goods ordered today will be needed next week. That customers who owe payment will survive to pay their debts. That the skills required for craftsmanship will remain valuable in coming months. When those assumptions become questionable, economic activity ceases even in places that haven't yet been directly affected by the crisis. Fear spreads faster than disease, and its effects prove almost as devastating to communities that depend on trust and cooperation for their prosperity. The first confirmed case arrives on a Tuesday, though the days of the week will soon lose their meaning as time becomes measured, not by calendar progression, but by the accumulation of death. A spice merchant who'd recently returned from Pisa collapses in the market square. Black swellings visible on his neck like grotesque jewelry that advertises his approaching death. The crowd that gathers around him reveals the city's first fracture along lines that will soon become chasms dividing the living from the dying, the rational from the panicked, the compassionate from the self-preserving. Some push closer, driven by morbid curiosity about symptoms they've only heard described in second-hand reports. Others back away, suddenly understanding that proximity to suffering might mean sharing in it. The merchant dies that afternoon, his death confirming that the plague has crossed every barrier that was supposed to protect Siena from external threats. Geography provided no protection. Walls proved useless against an enemy that travels in the lungs of merchants. Prosperity couldn't purchase immunity from a disease that seems to prefer well-fed victims over malnourished ones. The city authorities, men trained in law and governance but not in plague management, make their first fatal decision in a series of choices that will compound the crisis rather than containing it. They order the body burned immediately, hoping to destroy whatever evil spirit has possessed it and prevent its spread to others. The pyre that consumes the merchant's remains sends smoke rising over Siena like a signal announcing the beginning of the end. But the smoke carries more than the merchant's physical remains. It carries the city's innocence, its faith in human institutions, its confidence that civilized people can solve their problems through reason and cooperation. The fire that was supposed to protect the community instead becomes a beacon that attracts more cases, as if the disease feeds on the fear and uncertainty that the public burning creates. Within days, similar pyres dot the city like infernal lighthouses, guiding ships to their destruction rather than safety. Within days, the pattern becomes clear with the terrible reliability of natural law. The disease doesn't respect wealth, social position, or piety. It strikes the banking houses with the same indifference it shows the beggars' quarters. The richest families in Siena, accustomed to buying solutions to their problems, discover that death is the one merchant who doesn't negotiate. The Gallerani family, whose wealth rivaled royal treasuries, loses 3 generations within a week. Their palace, which once hosted visiting dignitaries and international bankers, becomes a tomb where servants afraid to enter leave food outside doors that no one answers. Their business empire, built over decades of careful management and shrewd investment, collapses overnight because dead men can't honor their contracts. The democratic nature of the plague's destruction reveals the fragility of social hierarchies that seemed as permanent as the stone buildings that housed them. When death claims nobles and peasants with equal enthusiasm, the divine right of kings becomes harder to justify. When bishops die as readily as the sinners they condemn, religious authority loses its credibility. You watch your city transform from organism to avalanche, from a living community with complex interconnected systems to a mass of debris tumbling downhill without direction or control. The first victims are mourned properly, buried with ceremony and grief that honors their memory while comforting their survivors. But as the numbers multiply beyond the capacity of traditional mourning rituals, individual sorrow becomes statistical nightmare that overwhelms the human capacity for emotional response. Families who lose one member to the plague find themselves nursing 3 others while trying to maintain hope that someone will survive to continue the family line. Households that seem stable on Monday are empty by Friday, their inhabitants dead or fled, their possessions abandoned to any scavenger brave enough to risk the lingering presence of death. The continuity that once seemed natural, fathers teaching sons, mothers training daughters, families extending themselves into the future through children, breaks down when entire bloodlines are extinguished within weeks. The forge closes on the 10th day, not because your father lacks the will to work, but because no one comes seeking his services. When survival becomes the only commerce that matters, horseshoes and kitchen knives lose their relevance. Your father stares at the cold forge like a musician whose instrument has been stolen, a craftsman whose skills have suddenly become obsolete. The silence where hammer blows once rang out hourly serves as a metaphor for the broader collapse of medieval society. The specialization that created prosperity, blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, merchants, each performing specific functions that served the broader community, becomes impossible when fear makes cooperation dangerous and death eliminates the expertise that sustained complex economic systems. Your father tries to maintain normalcy by organizing his tools, sharpening blades that no one will use, arranging the workspace for customers who will never come. These activities provide psychological comfort while serving no practical purpose. Ritual behaviors that help maintain identity when identity's foundations are crumbling. By the 3rd week, the city's infrastructure begins its collapse, like a building whose foundation stones are being removed one by one. The night watch abandons their posts, choosing to spend what might be their final hours with family rather than protecting neighborhoods that might not exist by morning. The markets, once vibrant with competition and commerce, become ghost towns where vendors fear their customers and customers fear each other. The bread that once seemed as reliable as sunrise goes unbaked because the bakers are dead or fled. The wine that once flowed freely remains sealed in cellars because no one wants to risk contact with strangers who might carry death in their breath. The breakdown of food distribution creates secondary crises that compound the plague's direct effects. Families with sick members can't leave to search for provisions. Healthy people hoard supplies rather than sharing them through normal commercial channels. The abundance that once characterized Siena's markets gives way to scarcity caused not by shortage, but by the breakdown of distribution systems. Water becomes a particular concern as the public wells that served individual neighborhoods become potential sources of contamination. Families begin hoarding water in containers never intended for storage, creating conditions that breed different diseases even as they try to protect themselves from the plague. The religious response proves as ineffective as the secular one, revealing the inadequacy of both divine and human authority when faced with catastrophe that exceeds all previous experience. Priests conduct increasingly desperate ceremonies designed to appease divine wrath, but their prayers seem to accelerate rather than slow the plague's progress. Father Giuseppe, the cathedral's senior priest, leads processions through streets littered with bodies while calling on God to spare the faithful and punish only the sinful. But the plague's victims include the most devout members of his congregation alongside notorious sinners, undermining his theological explanations and shaking the faith of survivors who had assumed that righteousness provided protection. The cathedral itself becomes a source of contagion as crowds of desperate people gather to pray for deliverance that never comes. The close quarters that once fostered community solidarity now facilitate disease transmission, turning places of worship into incubators for the very suffering they were supposed to alleviate. You develop your own symptoms on a Thursday that feels like the end of the world because for you it might be. It starts as a headache that transforms ordinary sunlight into needles, stabbing directly into your brain, making you understand why torture victims confess to crimes they didn't commit. The pain reaches levels that seem incompatible with continued consciousness, yet consciousness persists with merciless clarity. Your mother, who has been watching every family member for signs of infection with the intensity of a sentry guarding the gates of heaven, recognizes the warning immediately. Her face goes pale with the bloodless color of marble, but her hands remain steady as she helps you to bed with movements that combine tenderness with the efficient desperation of someone who understands that love must be expressed quickly. She speaks to you in the voice she used when you were small and frightened by thunderstorms, promising that everything will be fine while knowing that such promises have become meaningless. Her reassurances serve ritual purposes rather than practical ones, maintaining the forms of comfort even when comfort itself has become impossible. The fever arrives like a tide controlled by malevolent lunar forces, washing over you in waves that leave you shivering one moment and burning the next with temperatures that seem to cook your brain inside your skull. Your father sits beside your bed, reading prayers from a book that feels increasingly irrelevant, as God appears to have abandoned not just your city, but the entire concept of divine mercy. The prayers your father recites come from traditions developed over centuries by theologians who assumed that God's justice operated according to comprehensible principles. Good people received rewards, evil people faced punishment. Suffering served educational purposes that helped souls achieve salvation. But the plague's indiscriminate slaughter makes such reasoning seem like elaborate self-deception. Your mother applies cool cloths to your forehead with the futile persistence of someone trying to extinguish a house fire with a cup of water. The gesture provides more comfort to her than to you, giving her something constructive to do while watching her child disappear into the same darkness that has claimed half the city. The swellings appear on your groin first, hard lumps that pulse with their own malevolent life, like alien growths that have colonized your body for purposes you can't understand. The pain reaches beyond physical sensation into existential territory, as if your body is trying to turn itself inside out while your soul attempts to escape through any available opening. The buboes, as they're called in the medical texts that prove useless for treatment, grow to the size of chicken eggs, while radiating heat that makes touching them feel like grasping live coals. They represent the disease's signature, the unmistakable mark that distinguishes plague from ordinary illnesses that might be survived through rest and prayer. Your mother tries various remedies suggested by neighbors who heard them from someone whose cousin survived a similar illness in another city. Poultices made from herbs that are supposed to draw out the poison. Drinks concocted from ingredients that seem chosen more for their rarity than their effectiveness. Prayers directed towards saints who specialize in healing but appear to have abandoned their responsibilities. For 3 days you exist in a delirium where time becomes meaningless and reality blends with hallucination in ways that make both equally unreliable. You dream of the forge burning with supernatural fire that consumes metal along with wood, of streets running with blood instead of rainwater, of a great wind carrying away everything familiar until only emptiness remains. In your fever dreams, death walks through Siena like a merchant conducting inventory, checking names off a list that includes everyone you've ever known or loved. He appears sometimes as a skeleton, sometimes as a hooded figure, sometimes as a doctor whose treatments kill more certainly than any disease. But always, he moves with the methodical efficiency of someone completing a job that has clear objectives and unlimited time to achieve them. The delirium brings visions that feel more real than your actual surroundings. You see your city as it was before the plague, bustling with life and commerce and hope. You see it as it will be after the plague, empty and silent except for the wind that carries away the last echoes of human habitation. You see yourself as both victim and survivor, dying and living simultaneously in timelines that overlap like fever dreams. But on the fourth day, impossibly, inexplicably, against all probability and medical understanding, the fever breaks like storm clouds parting to reveal sunshine that seemed permanently lost. You wake to discover that your body has fought off the disease that killed stronger people with shorter struggles, leaving you among the small percentage of survivors who will inherit whatever remains of the world. You wake to silence so complete it feels like being buried alive in a tomb designed for entire civilizations. The familiar sounds of city life that have provided your existence's soundtrack since birth have vanished as completely as if they never existed. No cartwheels on cobblestones, no merchants calling their wares, no church bells marking hours that no longer matter. The absence of human-generated sound reveals natural noises that were previously masked by civilization's constant hum. Wind through empty buildings, birds that have begun to reclaim urban spaces, the settling of stone structures that no longer vibrate with human activity. Siena has become a tomb with you as its most unlikely living occupant. Rising from your sickbed requires enormous effort, as if you're climbing out of your own grave after a burial that almost became permanent. Your legs shake with weakness that makes standing feel like a tremendous achievement. Your vision remains blurry at the edges, making the familiar outlines of your home appear strange and dreamlike. Your mother is dead. You find her in the kitchen, collapsed over a pot of soup she'd been making for your recovery, her final act an expression of love that continued even after hope had been abandoned. The soup has begun to spoil, filling the kitchen with the sweet, sick smell that you'll learn to associate with decay and abandonment. Her face, turned toward the ceiling as if she died looking for help that never arrived, wears an expression of surprise rather than pain. The plague took her quickly, a mercy that wasn't extended to victims who suffered for days before finding release. Her hands still gripped the wooden spoon she was using to stir the broth, frozen in the gesture of maternal care that defined her existence. Your father died in his sleep, sitting in the chair beside your bed with his hand still reaching toward you as if blessing could travel through touch even after the soul had departed. The book of prayers lies open on his lap, its pages promising rewards in an afterlife that suddenly seems much more immediate than any earthly future. His face shows the peaceful expression of someone who died without struggle, his body simply stopping like a clock that wasn't wound. The prayer book contains marginalia in his careful handwriting, notes about passages that provided comfort during previous crises, but proved inadequate for the catastrophe that finally claimed him. You are 16 years old, and you are alone in ways that previous generations couldn't have imagined, because previous generations always had communities to provide support during times of loss. But communities require living people, and most of the people who might have helped you process your grief are dead or gone. The house feels enormous without their presence, every room echoing with conversations that will never happen again, and filled with objects that serve no purpose because no one remains to use them. Your parents' clothes hang in wardrobes like costumes waiting for actors who will never perform again. Their personal possessions, tools, books, cooking implements, remain organized according to habits that made sense when daily life followed predictable patterns. You wrap their bodies in the finest cloth your father's earnings could buy, a gesture that feels both necessary and absurd, given that no one will witness the ceremony or remember the care you took in preparing them for burial. The cloth, imported from Flanders at considerable expense, represents prosperity that no longer has meaning in a world where money can't purchase survival. The physical task of preparing your parents for burial forces you to confront the reality of death in immediate, tactile ways that make abstract grief concrete and specific. Their bodies have already begun the process of decay that will return them to the earth, requiring you to work quickly despite your weakness and emotional exhaustion. You drag their bodies to the backyard and dig graves with tools your father taught you to use for creation, not burial. The ground is hard, resistant, as if the earth itself is reluctant to accept so much death after centuries of supporting abundant life. The soil that once grew vegetables to feed your family now receives the bodies that will nourish whatever grows here in the future. By the time you finish, your hands are bleeding and your back aches with labor that feels like penance for the sin of survival, as if staying alive when everyone else died requires some form of physical suffering to balance the cosmic scales. The graves are shallow and poorly shaped compared to the work of professional gravediggers, but they serve their purpose of returning your parents to the earth with some measure of dignity. Standing over their graves, you speak words you compose yourself because all the traditional prayers seem inadequate for loss, this comprehensive, and circumstances this unprecedented. You promise them that their memory will outlive the plague, that their kindness will be remembered, even if their names are forgotten by future generations who never knew them. It's a promise you're not sure you can keep, because memory requires living people to maintain it, and living people have become rare commodities in a world where death has been more successful than life. But making the promise feels necessary, a way of asserting that love persists even when the beloved are gone. That meaning can be created even in circumstances that seem meaningless. When you venture into the streets, the transformation is complete and absolute, like stepping into an alternative universe where the laws of physics operate differently. Siena, once home to 40,000 souls living in complex relationships that created prosperity through cooperation, now echoes with the footsteps of perhaps 4,000 survivors scattered across a city designed for 10 times their number. Bodies lie in doorways like discarded furniture, some recognizable as former neighbors, and some decayed beyond identification. Houses stand open, their contents exposed to any scavenger brave enough to risk the lingering presence of death. Valuable objects that once represented wealth and status lie abandoned because no one remains who remembers their significance. The streets that once bustled with commerce now serve as outdoor morgues where family members placed relatives who died at home, hoping that city authorities would arrange proper burial. But the authorities are dead or fled, leaving bodies to decay where they were placed, until weather and scavengers complete the disposal process. You meet other survivors by accident rather than design, as they move through the city like ghosts avoiding contact with anything that might still be capable of inflicting harm. Their eyes show the hollow expression of people who have seen too much death to process normally, who have moved beyond ordinary grief into psychological territory that has no name. When you speak to them, conversation feels awkward, almost profane, like talking during a funeral service that encompasses the entire world. How do you discuss the weather when weather no longer affects the activities of dead people? How do you plan for tomorrow when tomorrow feels like a luxury you haven't earned through sufficient suffering? These encounters with other survivors reveal that the plague's psychological effects may prove as lasting as its demographic ones. People who witness the collapse of everything they believed permanent will never again assume that prosperity, safety, or human institutions can be trusted to endure. They carry trauma that will influence their decisions for whatever years remain to them. The city's last priest emerges from the cathedral, like a man walking out of a burning building, his vestments hanging loose on a frame diminished by grief and exhaustion. Father Giuseppe has spent the past month administering last rites to an endless procession of the dying, and the experience has aged him decades in weeks while testing his faith in ways that seminary training never anticipated. His eyes show the haunted expression of someone who has seen God's justice operate in ways that contradict everything he was taught about divine mercy and human worthiness. The theology that once provided clear answers to spiritual questions now seems inadequate for circumstances that exceed the imagination of the scholars who developed those doctrines. He gathers the survivors in the cathedral's nave, its vastness emphasizing how few of you remain while creating acoustic conditions that make whispered prayers echo like shouts in an empty tomb. The building that once seemed appropriately sized for Siena's population now feels like a monument to the dead, rather than a gathering place for the living. His sermon abandons traditional theology for something more immediate and practical. Guidance for people who must continue living in a world that seems designed for death. Where to find food that hasn't been contaminated by contact with plague victims. How to dispose of bodies before they breed more disease. Which neighborhoods still have survivors organized enough to provide mutual aid and protection? But the most important thing he tells you is this: you are not responsible for your survival. In the face of suffering, this vast, this indiscriminate survival isn't a reward for virtue or punishment for sin. It's simply the random outcome of biological lottery where some people's bodies fought off the disease and others didn't. This message provides crucial psychological relief for survivors who might otherwise spend their remaining years wondering why they lived when better people died, why God spared them while claiming the innocent and the righteous. The plague's arbitrary nature means that survival carries no moral implications beyond the responsibility to use continued life wisely. The priest's final words focus on the future rather than the past, on the work that survivors must undertake rather than the losses they must mourn. Reconstruction will require different skills than those that created pre-plague prosperity. Communities will need new forms of organization. Individuals will have to develop capabilities they never expected to need. That night, you sleep in your family's house for the last time, surrounded by possessions that once had meaning and now serve only as reminders of a life that ended when the plague arrived. Tomorrow, you'll join the other survivors in the more defensible neighborhoods, where communal living offers better protection against both disease and despair. You'll carry nothing with you except your father's hammer and your mother's recipes, the physical remnants of lives that meant everything to the people who lived them, but will be forgotten by future generations who never shared their experiences. These objects represent continuity across the rupture that separates the world before plague from whatever world comes after. As you drift off to sleep, you hear something that stops your heart with surprise. Laughter. Somewhere in the devastated city, other survivors have found something worth celebrating. It's not the hysterical laughter of madness, but the genuine joy of people who have rediscovered the simple pleasure of being alive when they expected to be dead. For the first time since the fever broke, you smile. The world has ended, but the people who remain are beginning the long work of building something new from the ashes of everything they've lost. Tomorrow will bring challenges that no one can imagine. But tonight, for just a moment, survival feels like victory rather than mere persistence. Survival, you learn during your first weeks among the living, is a skill no one teaches because no one expects you to need it, and the people who might have taught it are dead. The community of survivors that coalesces around the cathedral district operates by rules that would have seemed barbaric just months ago. But barbarism and civilization prove to be matters of perspective when the alternative is extinction. Property belongs to whoever can defend it. Leadership goes to whoever can make decisions others will follow. Social hierarchies that took centuries to establish dissolve overnight when everyone becomes equal in their vulnerability to starvation, violence, and despair. You find yourself part of a group that history will never record because history is written by people who assume that institutions survive to document events. The teenagers who inherited a devastated world. Marco, the banker's son who once spoke Latin and planned to study law in Bologna, now spends his days organizing burial details and mediating disputes over food distribution. Elena, the weaver's daughter, whose tapestries once decorated the houses of nobility, has become the group's unofficial leader because she possesses the rare combination of intelligence and emotional stability that crisis requires. Giovanni, the merchant's heir, who understood trade routes that no longer exist and could calculate exchange rates between currencies that are now worthless, applies his commercial skills to the problem of resource allocation among people who have nothing to trade except their labor and their loyalty to the group's survival. Together, you represent the lost generation, the inheritors of nothing except the responsibility to create something from the ruins of everything your parents built. Your childhood education, designed to prepare you for roles in a complex medieval society, proves almost useless for the practical problems of post-apocalyptic survival. But loss, you discover with surprise that borders on relief, can be surprisingly liberating when it removes the burden of living up to expectations that no longer apply. Without the forge to anchor your identity to your father's profession, you become something unprecedented in your family's history, a person defined by what you choose rather than what you inherit. The hammer your father gave you becomes a tool for building rather than just repairing, as you help construct the improvised shelters, barriers, and infrastructure that the survivor community needs to establish some measure of security in a city that has become dangerous for reasons beyond disease. The metallurgy skills you learned as a child, adapt to new purposes that your father never taught because he never imagined they would be necessary. You reinforce doors against desperate scavengers who might use violence to take what they can't produce through cooperation. You create tools for the massive cleanup ahead, implements designed for moving bodies and clearing debris rather than the profitable commercial work that once occupied the forge. You fashion simple weapons for people who never imagined they'd need to defend themselves against other humans. The practical challenges of survival dominate your first months in ways that make medieval prosperity seem like a dream remembered by someone else. Food, stored in warehouses designed to supply a city of 40,000, will theoretically feed 4,000 for years if properly rationed and preserved. But preservation becomes critical when there aren't enough people to consume perishables before they spoil, creating logistical problems that require solutions your parents' generation never needed to consider. You learn to smoke meat using techniques gleaned from half-remembered conversations with farmers who brought their products to Siena's market. You dry vegetables according to methods your grandmother mentioned in stories about the Great Famine, when preservation meant the difference between survival and starvation. You ferment grains into alcohols that will remain safe long after fresh water becomes contaminated by the bodies that couldn't be buried quickly enough. Water requires constant vigilance that makes every drink a calculated risk assessment. The wells that served individual neighborhoods now serve the entire surviving population, creating usage patterns that strain systems designed for different circumstances. You help establish schedules for drawing water, systems for testing its purity, and protocols for protecting the sources from contamination by desperate people who don't understand that poisoned water kills communities faster than any plague. It's democracy born from necessity, government created by people who need leadership more than they need leaders, administration developed by individuals who understand that survival requires cooperation, even when cooperation requires trusting people you barely know with decisions that affect everyone's lives. The bodies require attention that breaks your heart daily while teaching you lessons about human dignity that no religious instruction ever conveyed. Siena's survivors organized themselves into burial crews, not from civic duty, but from the practical understanding that plague dead left unburied breed more plague, creating secondary epidemics that can destroy communities that survived the initial outbreak. You spend weeks dragging corpses from houses where they died alone, loading them onto carts that creak under weight they were never designed to carry, and transporting them to mass graves dug in fields that once grew grain to feed the living. The work requires physical strength you're still developing and emotional resilience you're forced to create through daily practice with horror. Some bodies you recognize with shock that feels like physical blows. The baker who sold your family bread every morning, his hands still dusted with flour from the final loaves he baked before the plague claimed him. The priest who baptized you as an infant, his face peaceful despite the swellings that mark his death as plague-related. The girl from the weaver's quarter who smiled at you during festivals and made you dream of marriage and children who will now never exist. Each recognition feels like a small death of your own, a reminder that the person you were expected to become died with them, that your future was intimately connected to their survival in ways you never understood while they were alive. You are not just mourning the dead, you are mourning the version of yourself that would have existed if they had lived. But some aspects of survival prove unexpectedly rewarding in ways that make you understand why humans are capable of adapting to circumstances that seem impossible to endure. Without the complex social structures that once defined relationships according to birth, wealth, and family connections, people reveal themselves more honestly than medieval society typically allowed. Eleanor, who was trained to be demure and marriageable, emerges as a natural leader with an intuitive understanding of group psychology that makes her more effective than the formally educated men who assumed they would naturally assume leadership roles. Her ability to resolve conflicts, motivate exhausted workers, and maintain morale during the darkest periods proves more valuable than any traditional form of education. Marco, groomed for a life of banking and calculation, develops a fierce protectiveness that makes him the closest thing the survivors have to a warrior, someone willing to use violence when necessary to defend the group against threats that can't be resolved through negotiation or compromise. His commercial training helps him understand resource management, but his emotional evolution surprises everyone who knew him before the plague. You discover your own unexpected talents through necessity that forces rapid development of capabilities you didn't know you possessed. The patience you learned at the forge translates perfectly to the work of teaching traumatized survivors how to maintain their own tools and weapons, how to repair essential equipment when replacement parts don't exist. Your understanding of metal and fire proves invaluable when the group needs to establish heating systems for the harsh winter ahead, creating warmth distribution networks that serve multiple families from single sources. Your experience with physical labor helps you organize work crews that accomplish tasks requiring coordination between people who have no previous experience working together. Most surprisingly, your experience with loss helps you counsel others through grief that threatens to destroy them if left unprocessed. You understand the stages of mourning because you've lived through them. You know the difference between healthy sadness and destructive despair because you've felt both. You can offer hope because you've discovered that hope can coexist with realistic assessment of terrible circumstances. The winter of 1348 tests everything you've learned about survival, while teaching you new lessons about human endurance that will influence your understanding of what's possible for the rest of your life. Food stores that seemed adequate in autumn prove insufficient when cold weather increases caloric needs, and people require more energy to maintain body temperature in inadequately heated spaces. Fuel for heating requires constant scavenging expeditions to the abandoned quarters of the city, dangerous missions that risk encounters with desperate survivors who have chosen violence over cooperation, who view other groups as competitors for resources rather than potential allies in the struggle against winter's dangers. The scavenging expeditions become exercises in applied philosophy, as you're forced to decide which abandoned possessions can be taken without violating your moral principles. Books burned for warmth feel like acts of cultural vandalism, but frozen people can't preserve knowledge. Furniture broken up for fuel destroys the craftsmanship that represented someone's livelihood, but cold kills more certainly than unemployment. But the cold also brings unexpected gifts that help you understand why some catastrophes create opportunities alongside their destruction. The freezing temperatures finally halt the spread of disease, giving the survivors their first sense of safety since the plague arrived months ago. Bodies that couldn't be properly buried in the chaos of summer are preserved by ice, allowing for more dignified disposal when spring returns. Most importantly, the shared hardship of winter forges the survivors into something stronger than a random collection of refugees who happen to avoid death through biological lottery. The people who endure January and February together develop bonds that transcend the social distinctions that once separated them, creating new forms of family based on mutual dependence rather than blood relationships. You spend the long winter nights learning skills that no 16-year-old in history had to master, because no previous generation had to rebuild civilization from such basic components. How to negotiate disputes between desperate people without authority to enforce your decisions. How to motivate exhausted workers to undertake tasks necessary for group survival. How to maintain hope in people who have watched their world disappear. The education you receive during these months proves more comprehensive than anything the cathedral school could have provided, because it's based on immediate application rather than theoretical study. You learn leadership through leading, diplomacy through negotiating, psychology through counseling people whose minds have been broken by experiences that exceed normal human capacity to process. The stories told around the communal fires become your generation's literature, replacing the epic poems of noble knights and courtly love with practical tales of survival and adaptation that celebrate different virtues than those honored in traditional narratives. These stories will be passed down to children who grow up in the post-plague world, teaching them values that emphasize cooperation over competition, adaptability over tradition, practical wisdom over theoretical knowledge. Marco tells of the night he convinced a group of armed scavengers to leave peacefully by offering them information about untouched storehouses instead of fighting for scraps that wouldn't have sustained anyone for more than a few days. His story becomes a lesson about how negotiation can achieve better results than violence when both parties understand their mutual interest in survival. Elena recounts her method for convincing traumatized children to eat when grief had stolen their appetite. How she discovered that shared meals create psychological comfort that individual feeding can't provide. How food becomes a form of medicine when it carries emotional nourishment alongside physical sustenance. Your own contribution to this oral tradition becomes the story of the forge's last day. How your father spent his final healthy hours teaching you not just technique, but philosophy that proves applicable to circumstances he never imagined. How he explained that metal becomes strongest when it's heated beyond its breaking point, and then cooled slowly, carefully. How he said that societies, like swords, must sometimes be broken down completely before they can be reforged into something better. These stories serve practical purposes beyond entertainment, helping the group develop shared values and common understanding of how to handle situations that arise repeatedly in post-catastrophe circumstances. They become teaching tools that transmit wisdom gained through painful experience to people who might otherwise have to learn the same lessons through their own suffering. Spring arrives with revelations that reshape your understanding of survival, from something that affects only your small community to something that has transformed the entire known world. As the snow melts and the survivors venture beyond their winter shelters, you discover that Siena wasn't unique. Florence reports similar devastation. Rome, according to travelers brave enough to attempt the journey, has lost 2/3 of its population. The plague didn't just attack your city, it transformed the entire continent in ways that make your local experience part of a much larger story. The reports that filter in from other regions describe similar patterns of collapse and adaptation, suggesting that whatever emerges from this catastrophe will be fundamentally different from the medieval world that existed before. But spring also brings the first signs of renewal that make hope feel realistic rather than desperate. Elena discovers that she's pregnant, a development that forces the community to confront the possibility of a future worth planning for, instead of simply enduring day by day. The baby's father died in the plague's early days, but the survivors embrace the pregnancy as their collective responsibility. This child will be raised by the entire community, cared for by people who understand that new life is precious beyond calculation when human survival has become uncertain. The pregnancy changes everything about how the group makes decisions, shifting focus from immediate survival to long-term sustainability, from protecting what remains to creating what might become possible. Suddenly, decisions must consider not just immediate survival, but long-term sustainability that extends beyond the lives of current survivors. The group begins planning gardens that will provide fresh food, establishing schools that will educate children who have no memory of the pre-plague world, creating systems that can function for decades rather than months. You find yourself designated as one of the teachers, responsible for passing on the skills your father taught you to children who will grow up in a world he never could have imagined. The responsibility feels enormous because you're not just transmitting technical knowledge, you're helping to determine what aspects of pre-plague civilization will survive into whatever comes next. The teaching forces you to think clearly about which skills are essential and which were merely traditional, which knowledge serves practical purposes, and which simply maintained social structures that may not be worth preserving. You discover that much of what seemed important before the plague was actually arbitrary custom, while skills that seemed insignificant prove crucial for survival. Your 17th birthday passes without ceremony, marked only by Elena's observation that you've grown taller over the winter, that your shoulders have broadened with the physical labor that survival requires. Growth, she points out, proves that your body still believes in the future, even when your mind struggles with doubt about whether having a future is realistic. It's a perspective that helps you understand something crucial about human resilience. Survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about remaining human while doing so, maintaining the qualities that make life worth living, even when circumstances make staying alive difficult enough to consume all available energy. The baby arrives in late summer, a healthy girl whose cries echo through streets that had known only silence for too long. The community names her Speranza, hope, and her presence transforms the survivors' relationship with their devastated city. Siena, which had felt like a tomb where the living were temporary guests, suddenly feels like a nursery for possibilities no one had dared to imagine. The baby's birth creates practical challenges that the community solves through innovations that become permanent improvements to their way of life. Childcare responsibilities are shared among adults who don't have children of their own, but understand that everyone benefits when children receive the best possible care. Food preparation considers nutritional needs that support healthy development rather than just maintaining adult survival. Most importantly, Speranza's presence forces everyone to think beyond their own lifespans, to consider what kind of world they want to leave for someone whose entire life will be shaped by decisions they make now. This long-term perspective transforms survival planning into civilization building, shifting focus from enduring the present to creating a future. As autumn approaches, you realize that you've been changed by survival in ways that go beyond the obvious physical and emotional adaptations. The boy who expected to inherit his father's trade and continue an ancient tradition has become something unprecedented, a founding father of whatever civilization will emerge from the plague's ashes. The skills you're learning aren't just helping you survive the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. They're laying the foundation for social institutions, economic systems, and cultural practices that will influence how future generations organize their lives. You are participating in the creation of a new world, rather than simply preserving remnants of an old one. The responsibilities feel enormous and terrifying when you consider their full implications. Your generation will determine whether the knowledge accumulated over centuries survives or disappears into the darkness that followed the plague, whether the arts and sciences that made pre-plague civilization possible can be preserved and transmitted to children who have no memory of the world that created them, whether humanity emerges from this catastrophe stronger and wiser, or simply smaller and more afraid, whether the lessons learned through unimaginable suffering contribute to better ways of organizing human society, or whether future generations will repeat the same mistakes that made the plague's devastation possible. But you're no longer facing these responsibilities alone, isolated by loss and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond your control. The community of survivors has evolved into something resembling a family, bound together by shared trauma, but also by shared hope for what they might accomplish together. Elena's daughter will grow up with dozens of adults invested in her success, people who understand that her achievements represent victory over forces that seem determined to erase humanity entirely. The children who follow will be raised by people who know that every life represents a precious opportunity to justify the suffering that made their existence possible. As winter approaches again, you help the community prepare for challenges that are now familiar rather than terrifying, problems that can be solved through knowledge gained during the previous year's struggle. Food storage, fuel allocation, conflict resolution, education planning. The skills that once felt impossible to master now feel like natural extensions of your personality. You are no longer a survivor, you are a founder. You are no longer preserving the past, you are creating the future. You are no longer mourning what was lost, you are celebrating what has been found among the ruins of everything you thought you knew about how the world operates. That night, as you bank the forge fires that now warm the community rather than serving individual commercial purposes, you speak to your parents' memory with news that would have amazed them. You tell them about Elena's daughter, about the gardens planned for spring, about the school where children will learn both practical skills and the stories of the world that existed before the plague. You promise them that their deaths weren't meaningless, that the civilization they loved will survive in new forms created by the people they helped raise. You tell them that the hammer they gave you has become a tool for building rather than just repairing, that the skills they taught you are being passed on to children who will use them to create things they never imagined. The wind carries your words into darkness that doesn't feel like an ending anymore. It feels like the space between worlds, the pause before creation begins, the moment when everything becomes possible because everything that seemed permanent has been proven temporary. Tomorrow will bring new challenges that will test everything you've learned about survival, cooperation, and the human capacity to adapt to circumstances that exceed imagination. But tonight, for the first time since the plague arrived, you fall asleep feeling confident that whatever comes next, you and your community will find ways to meet it together. 2 years have passed since the ships arrived in Genoa, carrying death in their cargo holds, and you're beginning to understand that you didn't just survive a plague. You lived through the death of the medieval world and the birth of something unprecedented in human history. something that will reshape every assumption about how societies function and what individuals can accomplish when traditional structures collapse. The numbers, when traders finally brave the roads between cities and restore communication networks that the plague severed, tell a story almost too vast to comprehend, even for people who witnessed the catastrophe firsthand. Europe has lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population, depending on the region, and how you count deaths that can't be directly attributed to plague, but resulted from its secondary effects. England reports similar devastation, with entire villages abandoned, and agricultural regions reverting to wilderness because no one remains to work the land. France describes noble bloodlines extinguished and royal succession thrown into chaos, because death proved democratic in its selection of victims. The Germanic territories tell of trade routes abandoned and manufacturing centers emptied because specialized knowledge died with the craftsmen who possessed it. The Italian city-states, once the commercial heart of European prosperity, describe transformations that make your own experience seem almost modest by comparison. Venice lost half its population, but maintained its commercial networks, because maritime trade proved somewhat less vulnerable to disease transmission than overland routes. Florence suffered proportionally greater losses among its artistic and intellectual communities, creating cultural gaps that will influence the Renaissance that emerges from plague ashes. But the most profound changes aren't statistical, they're psychological, social, economic, spiritual. The rigid hierarchies that governed pre-plague society have collapsed not through revolution or reform, but through simple depopulation that makes traditional authority structures impossible to maintain when there aren't enough people to fill established roles. When half the nobles die alongside half the peasants, the divine right of kings becomes harder to justify to populations that watched royalty succumb to the same diseases that claimed beggars. When bishops perish as readily as sinners, the Church's claims about God's favor and religious authority require re-examination by believers who expected divine protection to follow clear moral guidelines. You see these changes most clearly in the survivors who drift into Siena throughout 1349 and 1350, arriving not as refugees seeking charity, but as free agents shopping for the best opportunities in a transformed world where labor scarcity gives workers unprecedented leverage in negotiations with employers. A former serf from the Tuscan countryside who now owns the farm, his grandfather worked as a tenant because the landlord's entire family died and no legal heirs survived to claim the property. A merchant's widow who controls trade routes, her husband never would have entrusted to a woman, because medieval assumptions about gender roles become irrelevant when competence matters more than convention. A young monk who questions doctrines that failed to protect his monastery from annihilation, who left religious life to pursue studies in natural philosophy because he wants to understand disease transmission through observation rather than accepting theological explanations that proved inadequate when tested by reality. These newcomers bring reports of similar transformations throughout plague-affected regions, stories that reveal how completely the catastrophe has altered European society's fundamental assumptions about authority, tradition, and social organization. Everywhere, practical ability matters more than inherited status. Everywhere, survival skills are valued more highly than traditional education. Everywhere, communities are reorganizing according to principles that emphasize cooperation over hierarchy. The economic transformations prove even more dramatic than the social ones, creating opportunities that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Labor, once abundant and cheap, becomes precious beyond gold, because there simply aren't enough people to perform all the tasks that complex societies require. Your skills as a metalworker, which would have earned modest wages in the pre-plague world where competition kept prices low, now command rates that would have seemed fantastical to your father. Survivors can afford to be selective about their work, accepting only projects that interest them or serve purposes they find meaningful, rather than taking whatever employment they can find. The scarcity of skilled craftsmen creates a seller's market that transforms relationships between workers and employers. Instead of workers competing for limited positions, employers compete for limited workers, driving up wages and improving working conditions in ways that will permanently alter European labor relations. Elena's evolution exemplifies these broader changes in ways that would have been unimaginable before the plague reshaped society's assumptions about women's capabilities. Before 1347, her future was circumscribed by gender, class, and family expectations that seemed as natural and unchangeable as the seasons. Marriage to an appropriate husband chosen by her family, children to continue his lineage, a lifetime of domestic duties performed in service to others' ambitions rather than her own aspirations. But the woman who emerges from the plague's ashes recognizes no such limitations because the social structures that enforced them no longer exist in meaningful form. She establishes herself as Siena's de facto coordinator of reconstruction, the person other survivors consult when disputes need resolution or resources require allocation among competing priorities. Her authority stems not from inherited position or formal appointment by traditional authorities, but from demonstrated competence in managing the impossible complexities of post-plague survival. When merchants arrive from other cities to establish new trading relationships, they negotiate with Elena as they would with any other political leader, treating her decisions as binding on the entire community. The transformation goes beyond individual advancement to encompass fundamental changes in how society thinks about gender roles, social mobility, and the relationship between birth circumstances and life opportunities. Elena's success proves that capability matters more than convention when survival is at stake, establishing precedents that will influence women's status for generations. The children born after the plague, like Elena's daughter Speranza and the others who follow, grow up in a world their parents couldn't have imagined during their own childhoods. They will never know the crushing weight of predetermined social roles, the assumption that birth determines destiny, the resignation that accepts limited opportunities as natural and unchangeable. They will inherit a society where ability matters more than ancestry, where innovation receives greater rewards than tradition, where individual achievement can reshape entire communities rather than simply serving established hierarchies. Their world will offer freedoms that previous generations couldn't have conceived because those freedoms required catastrophe to make them possible. You watch these changes with emotions that shift between exhilaration and melancholy, understanding that you're witnessing the birth of the modern world while mourning the destruction that made it necessary. The opportunities emerging from the plague's ashes would have been impossible for your generation under normal circumstances, but they're built on foundations that required your parents' deaths to establish. The intellectual ferment proves as significant as the social transformation, creating new ways of thinking about knowledge, authority, and the relationship between human reason and divine will. Survivors read voraciously, partly from boredom during the long isolation of early recovery, but also from hunger for understanding that traditional explanations can't satisfy. The conventional wisdom about suffering, divine punishment for human sinfulness, feels inadequate when applied to devastation this comprehensive and indiscriminate. If half of Europe died for its sins, what does that suggest about the other half who survived? If God's justice operates through plague, why did it claim the righteous alongside the wicked, the innocent children alongside the notorious sinners? New ideas circulate with the same speed that plague once spread, carried by travelers who move between recovering communities and exchange information about innovations in governance, technology, and social organization. Letters arrive from Florence describing experiments in democratic decision-making that abandon traditional aristocratic rule in favor of councils elected by survivors who proved their competence through successful adaptation to post-plague circumstances. Reports from Paris suggest that scholars there are questioning fundamental assumptions about natural philosophy, medicine, and theology that seemed unshakable before the plague tested them against reality and found them wanting. The catastrophe didn't just kill people, it killed certainties that had governed European thought for centuries. You contribute to this intellectual revolution through your own small innovations that prove influential beyond your immediate community. The forging techniques you develop for community projects become models that other settlements adopt when they learn about them through the informal networks that connect surviving craftsmen across the region. Your methods for training apprentices who lack traditional family structures influence educational approaches that spread as communities realize they need new ways of transmitting knowledge when the old systems based on hereditary craft guilds no longer function. Your documentation of survival strategies creates one of the first practical guides for post-catastrophe reconstruction, copied and adapted by groups facing similar challenges. Most significantly, your synthesis of traditional metalworking with post-plague innovations produces tools and techniques that surpass pre-catastrophe standards while requiring fewer specialized workers and less complex supply chains. These improvements will influence European technology development for decades, as communities discover that necessity-driven innovation often produces better results than tradition-bound practices. The religious implications of the plague continue to reverberate through every aspect of daily life, challenging theological assumptions that seemed unquestionable when they weren't tested by catastrophe that exceeded the imagination of the scholars who developed those doctrines. Father Giuseppe, who somehow maintained his faith through the worst months, preaches sermons that would have been considered heretical before the plague. He speaks of a God who works through human agency rather than divine intervention, who expects believers to solve earthly problems rather than simply enduring them until heavenly reward compensates for terrestrial suffering. His theology emphasizes human responsibility for creating justice rather than waiting for divine justice to manifest according to incomprehensible plan. But many survivors abandon Christianity entirely, turning instead to philosophies that emphasize human reason and rational investigation over faith in supernatural intervention that failed to prevent or limit the plague's devastation. The classical texts preserved in monastery libraries gain new relevance when applied to problems that medieval theology couldn't address adequately. Aristotle's writings on natural philosophy provide better guidance for understanding disease transmission than religious authorities who blamed supernatural causes rather than investigating natural mechanisms. Roman legal principles offer more practical frameworks for organizing post-plague communities than medieval concepts of divine hierarchy that assume social structures will remain stable indefinitely. The artistic renaissance begins almost immediately, driven by survivors who process their trauma through creative expression that breaks dramatically with previous traditions that emphasized religious themes and aristocratic patronage. The religious paintings that once dominated artistic production give way to works that celebrate human resilience, natural beauty, and individual achievement, rather than divine authority and noble privilege. Architecture becomes more practical, but also more personal, designed for communities rather than hierarchies, emphasizing functionality and comfort over symbolic displays of power and status. The buildings that rise from plague ruins reflect new values that prioritize human welfare over institutional grandeur. You commission a fresco for the reconstructed town hall, painted by a survivor who once worked as an assistant in famous workshops, but now creates original work that reflects post-plague sensibilities rather than pre-plague conventions. The image depicts not saints or nobles, but ordinary people engaged in the work of reconstruction that makes survival possible. Your father appears in the corner, teaching a young apprentice how to properly grip a hammer, representing the transmission of practical knowledge that enables communities to rebuild. Elena stands at the center, mediating a dispute between traders, symbolizing the new forms of leadership that emerge when competence matters more than birthright. Children play in streets cleared of debris and planted with gardens, representing hope for a future worth creating. The painting serves as both historical record and inspirational vision, documenting what has been accomplished while encouraging continued effort toward goals that seemed impossible when survival itself was uncertain. It demonstrates how art can serve community purposes beyond aesthetic pleasure, becoming a tool for maintaining morale and shared identity during difficult periods. The economic boom that follows the initial devastation exceeds everyone's expectations, creating prosperity levels that surprise communities who expected poverty to follow catastrophe. With fewer people competing for resources and abandoned property available for redistribution, survivors achieve wealth concentrations that would have required generations under normal circumstances. The redistribution of property from plague victims to survivors creates capital pools large enough to fund ambitious projects that improve infrastructure, expand trade networks, and develop technological innovations that enhance productivity. Roads get rebuilt to better standards. Harbors receive improvements that accommodate larger ships. Agricultural techniques advance through experimentation that increases yields per worker. But prosperity brings new challenges that survival-focused communities hadn't anticipated during their struggle to establish basic security. Success attracts immigration from regions still struggling with plague aftermath, creating tensions between established survivors who built the recovery and newcomers who expect to share in benefits they didn't help create. The egalitarian spirit born from shared trauma begins to fracture as communities become large enough to support traditional hierarchies and wealthy enough to sustain inequality. Early survivors who shared everything equally during desperate times now compete for advantages that their success has made possible, recreating some of the social stratification that the plague temporarily eliminated. You find yourself caught between competing visions of the future that reflect fundamental disagreements about which aspects of pre-plague society should be preserved and which should be abandoned permanently. Some survivors want to recreate the medieval world as closely as possible, viewing the changes forced by catastrophe as temporary expedients to be discarded once normal life resumed. Others see the plague as an opportunity to build something entirely new, free from the inequalities and inefficiencies that characterized medieval society before disease exposed its vulnerability. They argue for maintaining the social innovations that made survival possible, even when those innovations conflict with traditional ways of organizing community. The debate becomes personal when Elena announces her intention to marry Marco, a union that would have been impossible before the plague due to class differences between merchant and artisan families that seemed as permanent as the mountain. Some survivors celebrate the match as symbolic of their community's egalitarian values and evidence that merit matters more than ancestry. Others worry that allowing such flexibility in marriage customs will undermine the social stability necessary for long-term prosperity, that some traditional structures serve important purposes even when they seem arbitrary or unfair. They fear that too much change too quickly will create chaos rather than progress. The wedding, when it occurs, becomes a laboratory for post-plague social experimentation that tests whether innovation can coexist with stability, whether change can be managed without destroying the foundations that make community life possible. The ceremony combines traditional Christian elements with innovations born from necessity and choice rather than constraint. Elena and Marco exchange vows written themselves rather than reciting ancient formulas that assume relationships follow predetermined patterns. The celebration includes rituals honoring the dead alongside festivities celebrating the living, acknowledging loss while embracing hope. Most significantly, the couple pledges mutual partnership rather than hierarchical marriage, promising to share leadership rather than assigning it by gender, according to traditional custom. The wedding establishes precedents that influence how the community handles other social questions, demonstrating that tradition can be modified without being abandoned entirely, that innovation can enhance rather than destroy valuable customs when changes serve practical purposes that benefit everyone involved. As your 20th birthday approaches, you realize that you've become something unprecedented in human history. A young adult who helped design the civilization you inherited rather than simply accepting social arrangements created by previous generations. The world you live in bears little resemblance to the one you were born into, but it's a world your choices helped create rather than one you simply received passively. The technological innovations emerging from post-plague society reflect this spirit of purposeful creation, demonstrating how catastrophe can accelerate progress by forcing rapid adaptation to changed circumstances. Agricultural techniques developed to feed survivors with minimal labor revolutionize farming efficiency throughout Europe as news of successful innovations spreads through trading networks. Medical practices learned through desperate experimentation during the plague advance understanding of human anatomy and disease prevention in ways that will influence healthcare for centuries. The trial and error methods that saved lives when traditional treatments failed provide empirical knowledge that challenges theoretical approaches based on ancient authorities rather than observed results. Manufacturing processes designed for small communities with diverse skills create products that surpass pre-plague quality while requiring fewer specialized workers and less complex supply chains. The necessity of doing more with less drives innovations that prove superior to traditional methods, even when resource constraints no longer apply. Your own contribution to this technological revolution comes through metallurgy innovations, born from necessity when standard materials and techniques weren't available. Working with limited materials and minimal assistance, you develop forging techniques that produce stronger tools with less fuel consumption and shorter production times. These methods, documented and shared with other communities through the informal networks that connect surviving craftsmen, become standard practices that improve productivity across the continent. Your techniques influence everything from agricultural tools to construction materials to weapons manufacturing, contributing to the economic recovery that makes post-plague prosperity possible. The letters you exchange with survivors in other cities reveal that Siena's experience, while unique in its details, follows patterns repeated throughout plague-affected Europe. Everywhere, traditional authorities collapsed and were replaced by pragmatic leadership focused on immediate problems rather than abstract principles that sounded impressive but provided no practical guidance for unprecedented circumstances. Everywhere, social hierarchies flattened under the pressure of shared vulnerability and mutual dependence that made cooperation more valuable than competition. Everywhere, survivors discovered capabilities they never would have developed under normal circumstances, because normal circumstances didn't require such rapid adaptation to changed conditions. But the letters also reveal troubling trends that threaten the egalitarian spirit of early recovery, reminding you that human nature includes destructive impulses alongside the cooperative ones that made survival possible. Some regions have fallen under the control of warlords who use superior resources to dominate weakened communities rather than helping them recover. Others have fragmented into isolated settlements that view neighbors as competitors for scarce resources rather than potential allies in the struggle to rebuild civilization. The plague, it seems, destroyed the medieval world without guaranteeing that whatever emerged would be better than what was lost. These developments force you to confront uncomfortable questions about your own community's future that you'd preferred to avoid while focusing on immediate challenges. Siena's survivors have prospered through cooperation and shared decision-making, but their success makes them targets for less fortunate groups who might prefer conquest to the difficult work of building their own recovery. The peaceful reconstruction you've participated in may require military defense to survive, transforming victims into warriors and forcing communities built on cooperation to prepare for conflict. The cycle of violence that the plague temporarily interrupted threatens to resume with survivors as both victims and perpetrators. The formation of Siena's first post-plague militia marks a turning point in your community's development that tests whether the values that guided recovery can survive the practical demands of defense. The skills learned through survival and reconstruction must now be applied to organized violence, a transition that challenges everyone's commitment to the cooperative principles that made rebuilding possible. The irony isn't lost on you that the plague which destroyed medieval civilization through biological warfare may force its survivors to preserve their achievements through military action. The peace that catastrophe created by eliminating most potential combatants may be shattered by recovery that restores communities to levels of prosperity and organization that make them worth fighting over. But even this challenge generates innovations that strengthen rather than corrupt your community, demonstrating that the cooperative habits developed during recovery can be applied to defense without abandoning the principles that made cooperation successful. The militia organizes democratically, with officers chosen by consensus rather than appointed by traditional authority figures who might use military power to advance personal interests. Training emphasizes defense and deterrence rather than conquest and domination, focusing on protecting what has been built rather than taking what others have created. Most importantly, military service rotates among all capable adults, preventing the emergence of a warrior class that might challenge civilian leadership or use violence to resolve disputes that could be settled through negotiation. As 1351 draws to a close, you participate in the first comprehensive census of post-plague Siena, a count that serves both practical and symbolic purposes by documenting recovery while establishing baselines for future planning. The numbers tell a story of remarkable achievement that exceeds what anyone thought possible during the dark months, when survival itself seemed unlikely. Population has stabilized at around 4,000 and begun growing through both natural increase and immigration from less successful communities. Economic production has returned to pre-plague levels while requiring significantly less labor, demonstrating that necessity-driven innovation created permanent improvements in efficiency and productivity. Most encouragingly, the social innovations that emerged from survival necessity have evolved into permanent institutions that serve the community's long-term interests rather than simply addressing immediate crises. Democratic decision-making processes continue to function effectively, even when they're not required by desperate circumstances. Egalitarian social relationships persist despite the return of prosperity that could support traditional hierarchy. But the most significant change can't be quantified through census data because it exists in the minds of people who survived the end of the world and discovered that ending can also mean beginning. The certainties that once defined human experience, the assumption that the future would resemble the past, the belief that individual lives matter little in the grand sweep of history, the acceptance that social arrangements are permanent and unchangeable, all died with the plague victim. What emerged to replace those certainties was something unprecedented. A generation of people who understood that civilization is fragile, that social arrangements are chosen rather than inevitable, and that individuals can reshape the world through their responses to crisis, rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances they inherit. The plague didn't just kill medieval Europe. It gave birth to the modern European mind that questions authority, values individual achievement, and believes that human effort can improve social conditions rather than simply maintaining existing arrangements. These mental changes will prove more durable and influential than any physical reconstruction. You carry this knowledge as both burden and opportunity, understanding that the world your children inherit will be shaped by decisions you make, institutions you create, and values you choose to emphasize through your actions and teachings. The plague gave your generation the terrible gift of starting fresh, but it's up to you to determine whether that fresh start becomes a new dark age or a renaissance that justifies the suffering that made it possible. The responsibility feels overwhelming when you consider that your choices will influence not just your immediate community, but the entire trajectory of European civilization as it emerges from catastrophe. But the same experiences that created this responsibility also prepared you to handle it by teaching you that individuals can accomplish more than they imagined when circumstances require maximum effort and cooperation. That night, as you bank the fires that warm your expanding community and prepare for sleep in a world transformed by loss and renewed by hope, you speak again to your parents' memory with news that would have amazed them during their earthly lives. You tell them about the world being born from the ashes of the one they knew, about children who will grow up free from limitations that once seemed natural and inevitable. You promise them that their sacrifice, involuntary though it was, has made possible a future worth the price that was paid for it. You tell them that the hammer they gave you has become a symbol of reconstruction rather than just a tool for individual profit, that the skills they taught you are being used to build institutions that serve entire communities rather than just single families. The wind carries your words into darkness that no longer frightens you because you have learned to see darkness, not as the absence of light, but as the space where new light can be kindled. You are no longer the boy who expected to inherit a predetermined future from previous generations. You are the man who helped create a future that earlier generations couldn't have imagined. And tomorrow you will continue that work of creation, building on the foundation of survival to construct something that makes the struggle worthwhile. Tomorrow will bring new challenges that test everything you've learned about cooperation, innovation, and the human capacity to adapt and improve. But tonight you rest in the knowledge that whatever comes next, you and your community have the tools and the wisdom to meet it together. Now, as you drift off to sleep in a world transformed by loss and renewed by hope, take a moment to appreciate the medical knowledge that protects you from diseases that once decimated entire civilizations. Consider the social mobility that allows you to rise or fall based on your efforts, rather than your birth circumstances. Opportunities that plague survivors fought to create from the ashes of aristocratic privilege. Reflect on the individual freedoms that feel natural to you, but would have seemed impossible to someone living before humanity learned that the world can end and begin again, that social arrangements are choices rather than eternal laws, that ordinary people can reshape civilization when extraordinary circumstances demand extraordinary response. The Black Death taught Europe that civilization is not eternal, that social arrangements are not divine, and that individuals matter more than institutions when survival is at stake. Those lessons, learned through unimaginable suffering, became the foundation for everything we now take for granted about human rights, scientific method, and democratic governance. The Renaissance that followed the plague emerged directly from the social innovations that survivors created when they had to rebuild everything from scratch. The scientific revolution grew from the intellectual changes that occurred when traditional authorities failed to prevent or explain catastrophe. The democratic traditions that define modern politics developed from the cooperative practices that made recovery possible. You are living in the world that plague survivors built from the ashes of medieval certainty, enjoying freedoms that were purchased with the lives of people who didn't choose to make that sacrifice, but whose deaths made it possible anyway. Every breath you take without fear of invisible death, every choice you make about your own destiny, every assumption you hold about your right to happiness and fulfillment represents a victory over the forces that once made such things impossible for ordinary people. The darkness that once seemed like ending became the soil from which your world grew, rich with the nutrients that dead civilizations provide to whatever grows in their place. The medieval world had to die for the modern world to be born, and the people who lived through that transition paid prices that echo through history in the freedoms you inherit. Sleep well in that knowledge, and let the silence carry you gently into dreams that your medieval ancestors could never have imagined possible. Rest in the peace that comes from understanding that even the worst catastrophes can become foundations for better worlds, that human resilience can transform endings into beginnings, that hope can grow from ashes when people refuse to let death have the final word. The plague ended, the world began, and you are living in the light that emerged from that darkness, breathing air that carries the whispers of people who survived the impossible and built the future you call home. Good night.